Maverick gave it to me on a Tuesday, which should have been my first clue that something was off. Maverick never gives me anything on a Tuesday. Mondays, sure. Fridays, when he wants to ruin my weekend. But Tuesdays, he's usually in budget meetings until 3, and then he's useless for the rest of the day. This particular Tuesday, he came out of the budget meeting early, walked past my desk, and dropped a folder on top of the compliance paperwork I'd been pretending to finish.
"Backfill,"
he said.
"Piedmont Regional. 2 years old, needs a second review before it goes to permanent filing."
That was it. He kept walking. I looked at the folder for a second, then looked back at the compliance paperwork, then looked at the folder again. I had 2 active files already. A runway incursion out of O'Hare that was giving me headaches, and a maintenance documentation gap from a Southwest 737 that was giving me different headaches. I didn't need a third thing. But backfill is backfill. You don't push back on backfill. It's supposed to be easy. I moved the compliance paperwork to the left side of my desk, which is where things go when I'm not dealing with them yet. And I opened the Piedmont folder. The incident summary was on top. Piedmont Airlines. Regional route. Approach into Charlotte Douglas International. Both crew members simultaneously unresponsive for 31 seconds. The aircraft had drifted 400 feet in altitude before both pilots returned to normal function and corrected. No passenger injuries, no structural damage. The flight landed. Everyone walked off the plane. The official finding was an undetermined physiological event, probable hypoxia. Case closed. I read it twice. 31 seconds. Both of them. At the same time. I'm not going to say I've seen everything in 11 years at the NTSB, because that's the kind of thing people say right before something proves them wrong. But simultaneous crew incapacitation is not a common event. It's the kind of thing that generates paper. A lot of paper. Incident reports, medical evaluations, cockpit systems review, air traffic control logs, passenger statements if there were any, follow-up interviews with both crew members, toxicology. You pull all of it because when both pilots go down at the same time over a major airport, the question of why is not optional. The folder in my hands was thin. Not thin like we summarized the key documents. Thin like a lease agreement. Thin like a menu. I went through it page by page. The incident summary, a 2-page cockpit voice recorder transcript, a 1-page medical clearance for both crew members, a closure memo signed by whoever had handled the original investigation. That was it. 4 documents. No toxicology. No ATC log. No follow-up interviews. The medical clearance just said both pilots had been evaluated and cleared to return to duty, which told me nothing about what the evaluation actually found. The CVR transcript was the part that stopped me. It was formatted the standard way. Timestamps down the left margin, speaker designations, dialogue. The 31-second window was logged as no crew communication. That's normal enough. If the crew was unresponsive, there wouldn't be anything to transcribe. But there was a footnote at the bottom of the page, small, the kind of thing you'd skip if you were moving fast. It said the original audio file had been flagged as corrupted during processing and that the transcript had been generated from a cleaned version of the recording. I sat with that for a minute. A cleaned version. Which meant someone had taken the original audio, decided it was corrupted, and produced a transcript from a processed version instead. And the original, the actual unedited recording from the cockpit, wasn't in the file. I've worked enough CVR cases to know that corrupted gets used 2 ways. Sometimes the recording is genuinely degraded, equipment failure, magnetic interference, physical damage to the unit. That happens. But sometimes corrupted is the word that gets attached to a file when someone decides the file is a problem. It's a clean administrative move. You flag it, you replace it with something tidier, and the original goes into restricted archive where it technically still exists, but practically doesn't, because nobody's going to pull it unless they know to look. I didn't know yet which kind this was. Probably the first kind. Equipment issues happen, especially on older regional aircraft. I figured it was most likely just a sloppy original investigation. Someone who'd been overworked or undersupervised, who'd taken the probable hypoxia conclusion at face value and filed without doing the full pull. That happens too. It's not great, but it happens. The backfill review existed for exactly this reason. That's what I told myself. I filled out a standard archive request form for the original unedited audio and walked it down to records. Charlotte Douglas was at her desk, cardigan the color of old mustard, reading glasses pushed up into her hair the way she does when she's been staring at a screen too long. She took the form, looked it over, typed something I couldn't see.
Restricted archive, she said. 3 to 5 business days.
That's fine. She set the form in her processing tray. I was already turning to go when she said,
Is this the Piedmont file?
I stopped. Yeah. She nodded just once and looked back at her screen. Didn't say anything else. I stood there for half a second waiting for a follow-up that didn't come, then walked back to my desk. That was probably nothing. Charlotte processes a lot of requests. She remembers file names the way some people remember faces. Just a thing she does. It didn't mean anything. I put the Piedmont folder on the right side of my desk, which is where active things go, and I moved the O'Hare file back in front of me and tried to get back to work. The thing is, I kept thinking about the math of it. 31 seconds. Simultaneous. Over Charlotte Douglas International, which handles something like 400 flights a day. The probable hypoxia conclusion wasn't impossible. Hypoxia can hit fast, especially if there's a pressurization issue. But a pressurization issue that affects both crew members equally, at exactly the same moment, for exactly the same duration, and then resolves completely without any reported symptoms afterward. Both of them just back. Normal function, land the plane, walk off, cleared for return to duty. 31 seconds is not a long time. It's about as long as it takes to read a paragraph. But 400 feet of altitude drift happens fast when nobody's flying the plane. I got through maybe 40 minutes of the O'Hare file before I gave up, pretending I was focused on it. I pulled the Piedmont folder back over and read the closure memo again. It was signed by an investigator whose name I didn't recognize, dated about 6 weeks after the incident. The language was standard. Investigation complete. No actionable safety findings. Case closed pending final filing. Whoever had written it had been very good at sounding thorough while saying almost nothing. The gap between what had happened and what was in this folder was not a small gap. It was the kind of gap that meant either someone had done a genuinely bad job, or someone had done a very deliberate job of making it look like there was nothing to see. I didn't know which yet. I put the folder down. I'd have the audio in 3 to 5 days. I'd start there. The Piedmont crew contact info was in the file. 1 page, near the back, tucked behind the closure memo like an afterthought. Theo Green, first officer, current base Raleigh, Durham. Judith Price, captain, retired, listed at a residential address in Huntersville, North Carolina. Both had been interviewed once, about 6 weeks after the incident, by the same investigator who'd written the closure memo. I'd read those transcripts twice. They were short. The questions were short. The answers were short. Nobody had pushed on anything. I figured I'd start with Green since he was still active. Active crew are easier to reach and generally more used to talking to investigators. I found a contact number through the regional carrier's crew scheduling office, left my name and NTSB extension, and went back to the O'Hare file for about 20 minutes before my desk phone rang. This is Theo Green. Mild southern accent, relaxed like I'd called to confirm a lunch reservation. I introduced myself, told him it was a routine second review, standard language. He said sure, no problem. He had about 40 minutes before he needed to head out for a pre-flight. I asked him to walk me through the incident. He did. His version matched the transcript almost word for word, which told me he'd told it enough times that it had settled into a fixed shape. Approach into Charlotte Douglas, standard conditions, no anomalies flagged. Then, And here's where his pacing changed slightly, just a fraction. Then he said it was like stepping out of the room. I wrote that down. Stepping out of the room.
Can you say more about that?
I asked. He thought about it. Not long, maybe 3 seconds.
It wasn't like passing out,
he said.
Passing out has a before. You feel something coming. This was just, I was there and then I wasn't there and then I was there again.
Another pause.
The altimeter had moved. That was the first thing I noticed. Judy was already on it.
I asked if he'd felt anything during. Fear, disorientation, physical sensation.
No,
he said, and then quieter.
That's the part that's hard to explain.
I waited.
It wasn't unpleasant,
he said.
I know that sounds wrong given what happened to the altitude, but it wasn't. It was just quiet, and then it was over.
I asked if he'd had any recurring effects afterward. Sleep disturbance, anxiety, anything the flight surgeon had flagged.
Nothing,
he said.
Cleared full medical, back online in 3 weeks. I've thought about it a lot, though.
I asked what he meant by that. He took a second.
I don't know how to put it exactly. It's not that I want it to happen again. It's more like, you know how sometimes you go somewhere and it's a good place, and you don't need to go back, but you're glad you went.
He stopped.
That probably sounds strange.
I told him it didn't and thanked him for his time. He said good luck with the review and hung up. I sat there for a minute. The description itself wasn't what got me. Absence, return, no physiological precursor. That tracked with some of the hypoxia literature, or at least the edges of it. What got me was the tone. Green had described a 31-second dual incapacitation event that had put a commercial aircraft into an uncontrolled 400-foot altitude deviation, and he'd sounded the way people sound when they're talking about a good meal they had once. Fond, a little wistful, like the memory had a warmth to it that he couldn't fully account for and wasn't trying to. I wrote tone, wistful, not distressed, in the notebook, and underlined it once. Then I called Judith Price. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was measured, precise, the kind of voice that spent 30-something years communicating critical information clearly under pressure and never fully stops doing that even in retirement. I introduced myself, explained the second review. She said she'd been expecting someone to call eventually. I asked what she meant by that.
The original investigation felt incomplete,
she said.
I told the investigator that at the time.
I asked her to walk me through the incident. She did, and her account was clean and detailed in a way Green's hadn't been. She'd been on approach, had just completed a checklist call, and then there was nothing. No transition, no sensation of loss. Just a gap in the record. And then she was back, and the altimeter was reading wrong and her first officer was blinking at the instruments like he was recalibrating. She'd corrected the descent rate, called it in, landed the aircraft. Standard from that point forward.
Same as what's in the transcript,
I said.
Yes,
she said,
except for one thing.
I waited.
When I came back,
she said, and then she stopped for a second, choosing words carefully.
In the moment of returning, there was something.
I asked her to describe it.
Not a sound exactly,
she said.
Not words, more like a pattern. The way a phrase sounds in a language you almost know. You can hear the shape of it, but not the meaning.
She paused.
It was there for maybe half a second, and then it was gone.
I wrote that down, underlined it twice.
Have you experienced anything like it since?
I asked. There was a pause on her end that was a little longer than the others.
Every night,
she said.
In the half second before I fall asleep, I'm reaching for it, and then I'm asleep and it's gone.
She said it the same way she'd said everything else, Level, clear, no drama. Like she was reporting an instrument reading. The thing that was strange was that she didn't seem frightened by it. 2 years of a nightly pattern she couldn't quite catch, and she described it the way you describe a recurring weather system. Present, consistent, unresolved. I asked if it was distressing.
No,
She said.
it's more like unfinished.
Another pause.
I'm sure that doesn't help your report.
I told her it was useful and thanked her. She said if I had more questions, I knew where to find her. I hung up and looked at my notebook. 2 crew members, same 31 seconds. Both described the same clean absence, the same clean return. Neither of them sounded frightened. Green was wistful. Price was reaching for something in the dark every night, and had been doing it for 2 years, without apparent distress. That was its own kind of data point, and I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. I wrote, Price, pattern, half-second, nightly 2 years, and then I wrote, neither crew member reports fear, and then I drew a line under both of them, and closed the notebook. The audio request was still sitting somewhere in the archive system, working its way through 3 to 5 business days. I had the crew accounts. I had a closure memo that didn't match the severity of what had happened. I had 2 pilots who'd been through something genuinely strange and had come out the other side not traumatized, but somehow oriented toward it, like it had left a door slightly open. I put the notebook in my desk drawer and pulled the O'Hare file back over. I had work to do while I waited. The audio would get here when it got here. The file arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after I'd submitted the request. Charlotte sent the standard notification email. Archive request fulfilled. Case reference PDA 2241. And that was it. No note, no delay explanation. I clicked the attachment, saved it to the case folder, and put my headphones on. I had a specific pair I used for audio review. Sony MDR 750 Sicus, the ones with the coiled cable that always gets tangled around the desk leg. Standard issue for anyone doing serious playback work. Nothing fancy. I plugged them in, opened the file in the review software, and sat back. The first 29 minutes were exactly what you'd expect. Crew check-ins, altitude calls, comms with Charlotte approach. The kind of thing you stop really hearing after a while because it all sounds the same. Professional, clipped, 2 people doing their jobs in a small space at 30,000 feet. I had the transcript open in a second window and was following along, checking for discrepancies. There weren't any. Everything matched. The audio was clean, the voices were clear, the routine was routine. Then the 31 seconds started. I'd been expecting silence or static, some kind of degraded noise that would explain the corrupted file designation, a dropout, a feedback burst, the kind of thing that happens when recording equipment gets old or a connector works loose. That's what a corrupted file sounds like. I've reviewed enough of them. This wasn't that. There was a sound. I don't know how else to say it. It was there, in the gap, where the transcript logged no crew communication. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was low and rhythmic in a way that felt almost deliberate, occupying some frequency range that I couldn't have told you precisely without running analysis, but that I could hear, or almost hear, or feel at the edge of hearing, which is a distinction I don't have good language for. The headphones were doing something they probably weren't technically supposed to be able to do with a signal like that, and the sound was just there, running its 31 seconds. And then it stopped, and the crew came back on and called altitude, and that was the rest of the tape. I sat there for a second. Then I went back and listened again, and again. 4 times total, sitting at the desk with the coiled cable wrapped around the leg and the transcript still open in the second window and the office mostly empty because it was almost 6 and everyone else had gone home. By the 4th listen, I had a dull pressure behind both eyes. I took the headphones off and rubbed my face and figured it was screen fatigue. I'd been staring at monitors since 8 in the morning. That happens. It was a reasonable explanation, and I didn't spend a lot of time looking for a different one. I saved my notes, locked the file, shut the laptop, and drove home. I live in College Park, off Route 1, in an apartment complex that backs up to a parking structure. It's not a nice apartment, it's a functional apartment. I've been there 6 years, and I keep meaning to put something on the walls, and I haven't done it yet. That's me. I made dinner, pasta, the kind from a box, and watched about 20 minutes of something on my laptop before I gave up and just lay in the dark. The pressure behind my eyes had faded. That was fine. What wasn't fine, or wasn't exactly fine, was something else. Quieter, further back. Not pain, not even discomfort, really. Just a kind of low, patient activity in the back of my skull that I couldn't locate precisely and couldn't make stop. Like when you hear a song and can't remember the title, and your brain keeps reaching for it without asking your permission. Except I hadn't lost anything. I wasn't trying to remember something. There was just this thing going on back there, steady and unhurried, and I lay in the dark and waited for it to fade the way the eye pressure had faded. It didn't fade. I fell asleep eventually, I think around 2, and when I woke up at 6:30 it was still there. Same quality, same patience, same complete indifference to whether I found it convenient. I stood in the kitchen waiting for the coffee maker and thought about Judith Price reaching for a pattern in the half-second before sleep every night for 2 years. I'd written that down and drawn a line under it and filed it as data. It was still data, I just had a slightly different relationship to it now. I drank my coffee and opened my laptop. The database search took about 40 minutes. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking for, so I ran it broad first. Simultaneous crew unresponsiveness, duration under 60 seconds, no confirmed physiological cause, CVR anomaly of any kind, cases closed. I got a lot of noise. I narrowed it. 30 to 32 seconds, simultaneous, both crew, closed undetermined, 4 results. The Piedmont case I already had. The other 3 I didn't. A corporate charter out of Dulles 2.5 years back. A cargo flight out of Memphis about 18 months ago. A training flight out of Reagan National 11 months ago. All closed. All listed with some variation of probable hypoxia, undetermined physiological event. All 3 had CVR files flagged as corrupted in the original case documentation. I sat with that for a minute. 4 cases. Same 31-second window. Same closure language. Same archive flag. I wrote down the case numbers, pulled up the archive request form, and filled it out for all 3 original audio files. Then I walked downstairs to records. Charlotte was at her desk. She had a cardigan on, dark green, and was eating a granola bar over a paper towel in a way that suggested she was between tasks rather than on a real break. She looked up when I came in. 3 more requests, I said, and slid the form across the counter. She picked it up and read it. She didn't say anything for a second. Not a long second, just a beat, the kind you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention. She looked at the case numbers, and then she looked at me. "These are all original audio files," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the form again. Then she set it down and started entering the request into the system, which was the correct procedural response and exactly what I'd expected. Her fingers moved through the keystrokes, and she didn't look up. "Are you sleeping okay?" she said. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the question landed in a slightly strange place, and I wanted to make sure I'd heard it the way she'd meant it. "Fine," I said. "Just a lot going on." She nodded and printed the confirmation slip and handed it across the counter. 3 to 5 business days, she said. Same tone as always, completely normal. "Thanks, Charlotte." I took the slip and walked back upstairs and sat down at my desk and thought about that interaction for probably the rest of the day. Not obsessively, just the way you think about something that fits neatly into a category you haven't named yet. She'd asked a reasonable question. people asked that question. It was a normal thing to say to someone who looked tired. I just couldn't figure out why she'd asked it then, in that specific moment, after reading those specific case numbers. I put the confirmation slip in the case folder and pulled up my notes and kept working. The 3 files came in at the same time. That's the part I keep coming back to. I'd submitted the requests separately. Different case numbers, different archival dates, different incident locations. The Dulles charter, the Memphis cargo run, the Reagan training flight. Stuff that had been sitting in different parts of the system for different amounts of time. Charlotte had handed me a single confirmation slip, same as always, 3 to 5 business days. I wasn't expecting them to show up together. They did. 1 email, 3 attachments, timestamp 11:47 on a Thursday morning. I sat there for a second looking at it. The archive system doesn't batch files like that. It pulls from different nodes depending on where the original recording got stored, and those nodes don't coordinate releases. You get files when they're ready, individually, in whatever order the system processes them. Getting 3 at once from 3 separate archival dates wasn't how it worked. I'd been at the NTSB long enough to know that. I filed that away and opened the first one. I want to be honest about my headspace going in. The pressure behind my eyes had been there since the previous morning, and I'd been calling it screen fatigue because that's what it probably was. I'd been staring at documentation for days. I was tired. The explanation fit. I wasn't looking for something else to worry about, and I wasn't going in with any particular theory. I was just doing the work. The Dulles charter first. Corporate flight. 2 crew, both unresponsive for 31 seconds over the outer marker. I pulled up the transcript alongside the audio and ran them in parallel the way I'd done with Piedmont. First 22 minutes, routine. Radio calls, checklist items, a brief exchange about weather at the destination. Normal crew behavior, normal workload. Then the window. And there it was. Same sound. Not similar. Not a close match. The same thing. Sitting in the same frequency range. Doing the same rhythmic, almost structured thing it had done in the Piedmont file. I stopped the playback and just sat there for a second. Then I started it again from about 15 seconds before the window and let it run through. It began cleanly. No fade in, no build. It was just there and then it was there. And then 31 seconds later it wasn't. Clean off, like a switch. I opened the Memphis cargo file without letting myself think too much about what I'd just heard. Cargo flight, 2 crew, same profile. Unresponsive, 31 seconds, no confirmed physiological cause, case closed. I went straight to the window, same sound. I'm not a person who uses words like identical loosely. In my line of work, identical means something specific. It means 2 things that are indistinguishable when measured against each other. I don't use it to mean very similar. I use it to mean the same. These were the same. The Dulles file and the Memphis file and the Piedmont file had the same sound in the same frequency range with the same rhythmic structure, beginning and ending at the same clean points. And the only thing that varied was the ambient cockpit noise underneath it. I opened the Reagan training flight, 2 student pilots and an instructor, all 3 unresponsive 31 seconds, same closed designation, same sound. I pushed back from the desk and looked at the ceiling for a minute. The pressure behind my eyes had moved slightly. Still there, just a little more settled in, like it had found a comfortable position. I noticed that. I didn't do anything with it. I just noticed it and looked back at the screen. 4 incidents, 4 recordings, 1 sound. And it wasn't leaking in from somewhere. It wasn't bleed from a radio frequency or mechanical resonance from the airframe. It started when the crew went under, and it stopped when they came back, every single time. Clean at both ends. The crew hadn't stumbled into something ambient. Whatever this was, it had used the window the pilots provided. It had used them to run. I thought about Judith Price reaching for a pattern in the half-second before sleep. I thought about Theo Green saying it was like stepping out of the room. I sat with that for about 30 seconds and then did the practical thing, which was to clip 30 seconds from the Piedmont file, the clearest recording of the 4 best signal quality, and draft a quick email to Kelsey Kennedy. Kelsey was at the University of Maryland's Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. I'd worked with her twice before, both times on CVR analysis involving disputed audio. She was thorough and she didn't hedge. If she didn't know something, she said so. And if she did know something, she told you in plain language without making you feel like you needed a graduate degree to follow along. I trusted her read. The email was short. I told her I had an audio clip from a Federal Aviation file, 30 seconds, and I needed a sub-frequency analysis, specifically whether there was any embedded structure below the standard audible range and whether it looked natural or otherwise. I attached the clip and sent it before I could overthink the wording. That was around noon. I spent the next 6 hours doing the rest of the work, pulling the incident reports for all 4 cases, mapping the timeline, cross-referencing the archive flag designations. All 4 files had been flagged as corrupted originals. All 4 had been replaced with cleaned transcripts in the active case folders. All 4 had been closed. The flags weren't identical in language, but they were close enough that I started writing down the exact phrasing from each one, just to look at them side by side. Audio file rendered non-standard due to unexplained frequency interference. Original CVR audio flagged corrupted, transcript substituted per protocol. Recording quality insufficient for standard analysis, cleaned version on file. Source audio degraded, transcript record primary. 4 different cases, 4 different investigators, 4 different years, but the same basic move. Flag the audio, substitute the transcript, close the case. Nobody listening to the original, nobody asking what the frequency interference actually was. I was still looking at those 4 lines when my phone rang. Kelsey.
Hey,
I said.
Leo.
She had that tone she gets when something has her full attention. Focused, a little fast.
Where did you get this?
I told her it was from a federal CVR file, restricted archive, active investigation. She didn't push on it.
Okay,
she said.
So, there's a sub-frequency structure embedded in that clip that I cannot account for with any standard mechanical or atmospheric source. I'm talking about a layered pattern below 40 Hertz that has internal regularity. It's not random noise. It's not equipment artifact. The structure is too consistent. Consistent how? Intentional. That's the word I keep landing on. It looks like something that was put there.
She paused.
I want to run more analysis before I put anything in writing, but that's my read right now.
I wrote down intentional and underlined it once.
Anything else?
I said.
Yeah, actually.
She said it like it was a minor thing.
I've had a headache since I listened to it. Still there. Probably nothing, just I thought you should know.
I thanked her and told her I'd send the full set of files when she was ready for them. She said give her a couple days. We hung up. I put the phone down and looked at the notepad. Intentional. Underlined. Kennedy's headache. Charlotte pausing before processing the request, asking if I was sleeping okay. The pressure behind my own eyes that had been there since the morning after I first listened to the Piedmont file. The thing in the back of my skull that I still didn't have a name for, quiet and patient, just sitting there. I had 4 incidents. I had a frequency analysis pointing towards something that looked designed. I had a pattern of archive flags that had kept anyone from listening to the originals. And I had a short list of people who had touched the audio and come away carrying something they hadn't walked in with. I added Kennedy's name to my notes and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling again. The pressure behind my eyes didn't move. The full analysis took most of the next morning. I'd sent Kennedy the second batch of files the day after she called, once she said she was ready. She came back 2 days later with a written summary, which I printed out and set next to my own notes. 7 pages, dense, full of terminology I had to look up twice. The short version was this: the anomalous frequency structure existed in all 4 recordings. Same frequency range, same duration, same clean start and stop like a switch. Kennedy had run spectral comparisons across all 4 files, and the overlap was, in her words, statistically implausible as coincidence. She'd also confirmed it wasn't present anywhere else in the recordings. Not before the 31-second windows, not after. Just inside them. Beginning and ending like something had been turned on and then turned off. I sat with that for a while. The word implausible was doing a lot of work in Kennedy's summary. She was an acoustics researcher. She didn't deal in things that didn't have explanations. I'd worked with her twice before on noise complaints near regional airports, and she was the kind of person who could trace a sound back to a specific bolt on a specific piece of equipment. She didn't write implausible lightly. I added her summary to the file folder, which was getting thick. 4 incident reports, 4 CVR transcripts, 4 original audio files, Kennedy's analysis, my own frequency notes, the crew interviews with Green and Price. The archive request log showing all 4 files had been flagged as corrupted before the cleaned transcripts were substituted in. That last part was the part I kept coming back to. It wasn't one flag. It wasn't one case where a file got corrupted and someone made a judgment call. It was 4 separate incidents, 4 separate archive flags, 4 separate corrupted file designations, all applied individually, all resulting in the same outcome. The original audio buried, the clean transcript substituted, the case closed under undetermined physiological event, probable hypoxia. If you looked at any one of them, it looked like standard procedure. You had to look at all 4 together before the pattern showed up. And the only reason I'd looked at all 4 together was because I'd gone looking for similar incidents after the Piedmont file felt thin. Someone had counted on no one doing that. I didn't know who. I didn't have a name, didn't have a chain of custody for the archive flags, didn't have anything pointing at a specific person or office. What I had was a pattern that was either a very strange coincidence or a deliberate decision made by someone who understood the archive system well enough to use it as a filing cabinet for things they didn't want found. I wasn't going to speculate about which one in a formal report, but I wasn't going to pretend I didn't see it either. The correct move, procedurally, was clear. Flag the files, write a summary memo, walk everything up to Maverick. He was deputy director. This was exactly the kind of thing that was supposed to go to him. I knew what would happen next. I'd been at the NTSB for 11 years. I'd watched 2 other findings get absorbed into the review process and come out the other side with the edges sanded off. One was a maintenance documentation issue that became a recommended procedural clarification. The other was a contractor compliance failure that became a noted area for improvement. Both times, the original finding was technically preserved somewhere in a file. Both times, nothing changed. Both times, the people who needed to act on it had decided the cost of acting was higher than the cost of not acting. And that was that. This was different in degree, not in kind. If I sent this to Maverick, the corrupted file designation would get reapplied, probably within a week. The cases would stay closed. Someone would have made the same suppression choice a second time with full knowledge of what they were suppressing. And the only difference from the first time was that now they'd know someone had found the pattern. That felt worse, actually. That felt like a decision made with eyes open. I sat at the desk for a long time thinking about that. The thing is, I'm not great at writing memos. I'm better at full reports. That's probably not the real reason I decided to write the full report instead, but it's not entirely untrue either. I opened a new document and started from the beginning. It took 3 days. I wrote all 4 incidents in sequence, with timelines. I wrote the crew interviews. Green's description of the 31 seconds as absence. Price's description of the sound she'd been reaching for in the half-second before sleep for 2 years. I wrote the archive flag pattern in its own section, laid out plainly, without characterizing it. I wrote the frequency analysis with Kennedy's findings attached as an appendix. I wrote the overlap between all 4 recordings, the clean start and stop, the absence of the anomaly anywhere outside the windows. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate about cause or intent. I just put down what was there and let it sit next to itself. By the 3rd day, it was 42 pages. That's the longest report I'd produced since a runway incursion case in 2019 that had taken 6 weeks and 3 interviews to untangle. This one had taken less time, but it felt heavier, maybe because I understood what I was holding. The runway incursion case was complicated. This one was complicated in a different way. The evidence was clear. The pattern was clear. The only unclear part was the thing the evidence was pointing at, which was something I didn't have a category for, and neither did Kennedy, and neither, I suspected, would anyone who read the report. I read the whole thing through twice on the 3rd night, sitting in the office after everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet. The fluorescent light above my desk had been flickering for 2 weeks and nobody had fixed it yet, so it ticked softly every few minutes while I read. It was the most complete work I'd done in 11 years. I knew that. I also knew it was going to land somewhere and cause a problem for someone, and I knew I was probably going to be part of that problem. I'd thought about that. I thought about it more than I'd thought about most things in the last week, which was saying something because I hadn't been sleeping well. The pressure behind my eyes was still there, quiet, patient. I saved the document. I opened the Federal Disclosure Portal, which is about as glamorous as it sounds. A gray web interface with a file upload field and a submission confirmation button. I'd used it maybe a dozen times in 11 years, mostly for routine findings that had already been reviewed and cleared. This one hadn't been reviewed and cleared. That was the point. Federal disclosure law didn't require prior clearance for safety documentation. It required accurate documentation submitted in full. I had accurate documentation. I had submitted it in full to no one yet. I uploaded the file. The confirmation screen said submission received and gave me a reference number, which I wrote down on the notepad next to Kennedy's name and the word intentional and the pressure behind my eyes that still hadn't moved. I logged out of the portal and closed my laptop and sat there for a minute in the flickering light. That was it. The report was in the system. It would publish automatically according to standard disclosure timelines, and after that, it would be a matter of public record, and nobody would be able to reapply the corrupted file designation without falsifying federal safety documentation, which was a different category of problem than the one I was already in. I picked up my bag and turned off the desk lamp and walked out. The next morning I got to the office early, not on purpose. I just woke up at 5:40 something and couldn't find a reason to stay in bed, so I made coffee in the little French press I keep on the counter and sat at the kitchen table and didn't do much of anything for about 40 minutes. The pressure behind my eyes was still there, quieter than it had been the night before, but there. I got in around 7:15. The building was mostly empty. I said hi to the security guy at the front desk. Hector, works the early shift, has a Redskins mug he's been drinking out of for at least 3 years, and took the elevator up. My floor was dark except for the emergency lighting and one overhead strip near the copy room that never fully shuts off. I turned on my desk lamp, sat down, and opened my laptop. The report was live. I'd known it would be. That was the whole point. But seeing it sitting there in the Public Records Index with a timestamp and a reference number and my name on the authorship line was a different thing from knowing it would be there. I looked at it for maybe 10 seconds. Then I closed that tab and opened my email. Nothing unusual. A reminder about a compliance training module due at the end of the month. A reply from a lab in Atlanta about an unrelated case I'd mostly handed off. One forward from Maverick's assistant about a scheduling change for a meeting I wasn't even in. I got up, refilled my coffee from the break room, and came back and started going through the routine stuff. By 9, the floor had filled up. Phones, keyboards, someone's lunch already in the microwave even though it was barely mid-morning, normal Tuesday. I kept working. The first newsletter hit sometime around noon. I only knew because I happened to be searching the public index for an unrelated reference, and the Piedmont report came up in a sidebar under Recently Cited. The citation was from something called Aviation Safety Digest, which I'd heard of but never read. They'd indexed the report in full and pulled 3 paragraphs from the frequency analysis section. The headline was something like, NTSB report flags unexplained acoustic anomaly in 4 CVR files. Accurate. Dry. Exactly the kind of thing that circulates inside the industry for a week and then disappears. I figured that was probably it. By the end of the day, there were 2 more. One from a regional safety newsletter out of Atlanta, and one from a database aggregator that just automatically indexes anything new in the federal disclosure system. 3 total, all pulling from the same section of the report. All framing it as an interesting anomaly, a data irregularity, a thing worth noting. I went home, made pasta, watched about 20 minutes of something on Netflix that I couldn't tell you the name of now. Went to bed around 10:30 and lay there for a while with the lamp off, listening to the street noise outside and the pressure sitting quietly behind my eyes, and eventually fell asleep. The second day was quieter, no new citations that I found. Maverick stopped by my desk around 2 and asked how the Piedmont write-up was coming, and I told him it was submitted, and he said good, and walked away. That was the whole conversation. I didn't mention the public filing. He didn't ask. I figured he'd see it eventually, and we'd have a conversation that I wasn't especially looking forward to. But that was a later problem. The emails started on the 3rd day. The first one came in around 9 in the morning from a guy named Darnell Okafor, senior investigator out of the Seattle field office. I didn't know him personally, just recognized the name from a joint report a few years back. He'd read the frequency analysis section. He said he'd read it twice, actually, because the sub-frequency description was unusual enough that he wanted to make sure he was understanding it correctly. He asked 2 technical questions about Kennedy's methodology, and then, at the end, kind of tucked in after the technical stuff, he mentioned that he'd had a headache since reading it the previous night. Pressure, he said, behind both eyes. I read that part twice. I wrote back with answers to the technical questions and didn't address the last part. I didn't know what I would have said. The second email came in around 11. Different office, different name, same thing at the end. Pressure, persistent. Started after reading the frequency section. Then a third one in the afternoon. I sat with that for a while. I wasn't panicking. That's not really how I process things. But I was doing the math, and the math was not comfortable. The frequency analysis section was the most detailed part of the report. It was the part where I'd laid out exactly what Kennedy had found, exactly what the sub-frequency structure looked like, exactly how it appeared and disappeared at the 31-second marks. I'd written it the way I write everything, precise, complete, nothing left out, because leaving things out would have been falsification. I described the thing well enough that reading the description was apparently doing something similar to what the original audio had done. I got up and walked to the window and looked out at the parking structure across the street for a minute. Then I came back and sat down and kept working because there wasn't anything else to do. The 4th email arrived the next morning. That one was from Judy Weaver. I didn't know her name yet. I had to look her up. She covered FAA oversight for something called Federal Aviation Report, a DC trade publication that I'd seen referenced a few times but never actually read. Her email was short, professional. She said she'd flagged the Piedmont report for a story she was developing about CVR data integrity and archive classification practices, and she had some questions when I had time. That was the first paragraph. The second paragraph was different. She said she'd read the full report, including the frequency analysis section, and she wanted to ask directly, was I experiencing anything she might describe as a second voice settling into the back of the skull, patient and rhythmic, almost a pattern? Because she was. She'd been experiencing it since the night she'd read the report. She wasn't asking to be dramatic about it, she said. She was asking because she was a reporter, and she wanted to know whether the person who wrote the report was working from the inside of the same experience or the outside of it. I read that email 3 times. The phrase she'd used, second voice, patient and rhythmic, almost a pattern, was close enough to what had been sitting in the back of my own skull for 2 weeks that I had to stop and just look at the wall for a second. She hadn't gotten that from the report. The report described the frequency, the structure, the technical findings. It didn't describe the subjective experience of carrying it. She'd arrived at that description on her own, which meant she was carrying the same thing. I closed the laptop. Not because I was done, just because I needed a minute where the screen wasn't in front of me. The report was accurate. It was thorough. It was legally required. I'd documented everything correctly and submitted it through the right channel, and I would do all of it exactly the same way again, because the alternative was falsifying federal safety documentation, and that was not something I was going to do. It was also, I now understood completely, a precise and detailed description of the exact phenomenon it was describing, specific enough that reading the right sections was apparently sufficient. I'd written a document thorough enough to function as a transmission, and I'd submitted it to the public record, and the public record had done what it does. I sat there with the closed laptop and the quiet pressure behind my eyes and thought about the 3 investigators who'd emailed, and Judy Weaver, and whoever else had read far enough into the frequency analysis section and hadn't emailed yet. The report wasn't going away. That was the other thing. It was in the federal disclosure system now, indexed by 3 newsletters, flagged by a journalist who was actively developing a story. Maverick couldn't reclassify it. Nobody could reapply the corrupted file designation without creating a paper trail that would be worse than the report itself. I'd made sure of that, on purpose. I sat there for a while longer. Then I opened the laptop back up and started writing a reply to Judy Weaver. The reply to Judy Weaver took me about 40 minutes, which is longer than it should have taken for something that short. I kept starting and deleting. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because every version I wrote sounded either too clinical or too much, like I was admitting something I hadn't fully worked out yet. I'm not great at that middle ground. I ended up with something pretty plain. Confirmed that yes, I'd been experiencing the pressure since the first audio file, approximately 2 weeks prior. Confirmed that based on her description and the descriptions from the 3 investigators who'd written in, the symptom profile appeared consistent across subjects. Told her the frequency analysis section was the relevant part of the report, that Kennedy's findings were the most technically specific, and that I'd be available for a follow-up call if she was developing a story. I didn't tell her I'd been sitting in a dark apartment for the better part of an hour thinking about a retired pilot in Huntersville who'd been reaching for something in the half second before sleep every night for 2 years. I sent it and closed the laptop again. The apartment was quiet. I live in a second-floor unit on Guilford Drive, maybe 8 minutes from the University of Maryland campus. It's fine. Small kitchen, 1 bedroom, a desk I bought used from a grad student 3 years ago that still has a small coffee ring on the left corner I've never bothered to do anything about. The street outside gets a little traffic noise around 7 in the morning and then mostly nothing. It was past midnight by then. Nothing outside. I sat there for a while. The pressure behind my eyes was still there. Not bad. Manageable. The kind of thing you stop noticing until you notice it again, and then it's just there. Patient. Like it had been there all along and you'd been the one not paying attention. That was the part that was hard to explain even to myself. It didn't feel like a symptom. It felt like a fact. Something that had been added to the room and stayed. I thought about Judith Price. I'd been thinking about her on and off since the interview, but more specifically since I'd listened to the audio and understood what she'd actually been describing. She'd said it was like a phrase in a language almost known. She'd been precise about that. Not a word, not a sound. A phrase. Something with structure. Something that meant something. probably in some framework she didn't have access to. She'd been reaching for it for 2 years, and she hadn't sounded frightened. She'd sounded like someone working a problem, like someone who'd accepted that the problem might not resolve and had made a kind of peace with that. I didn't know if I'd make the same peace. I figured I'd find out. Theo Green hadn't sounded frightened either. He'd sounded wistful. That was the word I kept coming back to. Like the 31 seconds was a place he'd been once and wouldn't mind going back to. I thought that was strange when he said it. I thought about it differently now. I wasn't wistful about it. Not yet, anyway. Mostly I was tired and my eyes hurt, and I had a reply from Judy Weaver sitting in my inbox that I wasn't going to look at until morning. I looked at it anyway. She wrote fast. The email came in 11 minutes after I'd sent mine. She said she'd been experiencing the pressure since 2 days after the report published, which tracked with when the newsletters had indexed it. She said she'd read the frequency analysis section 3 times because she was writing about it and she wanted to get the technical framing right. And she thought that probably hadn't helped. Then she asked if I thought the report should have been suppressed. I read that twice. I got up and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood there for a minute. The kitchen light was the only light on in the apartment. The faucet has a slow drip. I've been meaning to report to the building manager for about 4 months. It dripped twice while I stood there. The answer was no. Obviously no. The 4 incidents were real, documented, cross-referenced, and part of the Federal Aviation Safety Record. Suppressing them meant falsifying that record. I'd been over this. I'd been over it thoroughly before I submitted the report, and I'd been over it again in the hour before I wrote to Judy Weaver, and the answer had been the same both times. You don't falsify federal safety documentation. That's not a complicated position. The other answer, the one that sat underneath the first one, was that I'd known what the report would do when I submitted it. Not precisely, but I'd known Kennedy was still having a headache 6 hours after listening to a 30-second clip. I'd known the frequency analysis section was specific enough that reading it carefully was apparently sufficient. I'd known the report was going to be indexed and read, and that some of the people who read it would read it carefully. I'd known all of that, and I'd submitted it anyway, because the alternative was the thing I wasn't going to do. I didn't know if that made it the right call, or just the only call I was capable of making. Probably both. That's me. I went back to the desk and wrote back to Judy Weaver, told her no, the report shouldn't have been suppressed, and explained why in about 4 sentences. Told her the question for the story wasn't whether the report should exist, but why 4 incidents with identical profiles had been closed without cross-referencing, and who had made that call, and whether they'd made it knowing what the audio contained. Told her Kennedy was the right person to talk to about the technical side, and that I'd give Kennedy a heads up if she wanted to reach out. She replied in 8 minutes, said that was exactly the story, said she'd be in touch. I closed the laptop and didn't open it again. I sat at the desk for a while. The coffee ring on the left corner was visible in the light from the street coming through the window. I'd had the desk for 3 years, and I'd never learned whose coffee it was originally. The pressure was still there. Quiet, patient, somewhere in the back of the skull, just doing whatever it was doing, not asking anything from me right now. I thought about the 4 flights, the Piedmont Regional over Charlotte, the corporate charter out of Dulles, the cargo run from Memphis, the training flight from Reagan. 4 crews, 4 31-second windows, the same sound in all of them, beginning and ending clean, like something that knew exactly how long it needed. I thought about the fact that I'd been carrying it for 2 weeks and I was still here, still functional, still writing accurate reports and answering emails and thinking clearly enough to know what I'd done and why. Judith Price had been carrying it for 2 years. She lived in Huntersville. She wore linen shirts. She went for walks, probably. She'd sat across from me in her living room and described the whole thing with the precise calm of someone who'd made her peace with an open question. She wasn't diminished by it. She was just living with it. reaching for it in the half second before sleep every night because it was there and it was almost something, and that was the situation. I figured that was probably what came next for me too. Not soon, but eventually. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a minute. The street was quiet. The faucet dripped once from the kitchen. Then I went to bed. I lay there in the dark with the pressure behind my eyes and the quiet rhythm of whatever was settled in the back of my skull, patient and unhurried, and I waited for sleep. It came. And in the half second before it did, there was something almost there. A structure, a shape, almost a phrase. And I reached for it the way you reach for a word you know. I didn't get it. But I would try again tomorrow.